Well, hi, Claire. Welcome to the Tropical Social Podcast. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited. I know it's been a little while. For those that don't know, I actually met up with Claire in Sydney, Australia when I was there. So
Yeah.
I am very jealous that I'm still in Australia. But with that said, Claire, for those who may not be familiar with you, can you kind of take us back to the beginning? Like, what actually led you to start Claire Elizabeth Co.? How did you actually go from that $5 an hour VA to actually building your thriving operations consultancy?
Yeah, so it's kind of a three-part because there were three very distinct events that kind of happened that made everything make sense. And when I finally made the decision, it was like, oh, there was nothing else I was supposed to do. I was working as a part-time VA. I was getting like $5 an hour from this agency that I no longer think is around. And I'm not
Yeah.
going to name drop it. So it was just one of those things where it was the very beginning. This was like 2018 when people were kind of looking more into getting online help for some of the things that they were doing. So I was in on this like VA online work very early. And I was working in corporate full time, and it was just like hitting a wall every single day. I was definitely burnt out. I was exhausted. So making the switch to go full time online, I actually found a full time role online, which was like unheard of at that time. I thought it was fake when I applied for it, and it ended up being like one of my favorite jobs. But
Yeah.
I wasn't there too long just because then I followed my boyfriend at the time, now husband, to Australia right before COVID hit. So it was just like the perfect storm of like, I need to lean into what I already know. Working from home in Australia, that wasn't really the culture. Here, it really wasn't a thing. So trying to find a role when I've been working from home for the last 6, 7-ish months full time was a little bit difficult. I had a lot of visa restrictions. A lot of things were happening with COVID that a lot of places weren't hiring. So I just felt like it was just pushing me towards working on my own thing. When my Grammy passed away 6 months after I moved, it was just kind of like the final straw for me that I knew I wanted to make something worth it while I was here. And I didn't want to move for nothing. I really wanted to make it worth it and just like prove to not only myself, but also my family. And of course, everything I do to honor my Grammy so that she knows that I can do this and she's proud of me. And yeah, it was just like the perfect storm of all of those instances that kind of pushed me into starting my own business and then running with it. It's been 5 years now. I'm on my fifth year of just like, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. This is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's like from the very beginning.
I mean, I'm sure I'll dive further into your story as well, but I know so many, I feel like basically every single guest that I've ever interviewed on this podcast started their business out of COVID. So I feel like
Yes, yeah.
obviously there's a lot of negative things that obviously happened with the pandemic, but I think there's a lot of just beautiful things in terms of like women being able to start their own businesses and realizing like, okay, I can actually take this online just like you did and actually starting
Yes,
your own thing versus working for a $5 an hour. That's just like
which is
insane.
crazy.
Yeah. So you mentioned moving to Australia, and I know that that was a few years ago. But obviously, moving countries, I know I've done it myself, is like a really big transition, and it can be very overwhelming. So I guess with that said, what were some of kind of like the biggest challenges that you faced, whether it was legal, financial, cultural shocks, and how did you go ahead and navigate them?
When I first moved, I really wanted to give it like the good college try. Like, I'm going to try to get a job one more time in corporate. Because it doesn't matter. Like, even though I was really good I had two VA clients as well that I took with me when I moved. Even though I was really good at it and it made me really happy, the voice, not even the voice in my head, but everybody around me being like, oh, that's not a real job. You can't do that full time. Like, it's just a hobby, like that really runs as a track in your head. And so it was like, well, I'm going to try to go back into corporate because that's what everybody wants me to do. And that's what, like, I had my family kind of being like, is she going to make it? I had people kind of watching me. And so for me, getting a corporate job would be like, oh, I can do this. And so I applied like over 110 times. I
Oh my
interviewed
gosh.
over 15 times. And it was, again, like just the state of where everything was at was very up in the air. I had a couple job offers and that never ended up going through just because of like things were shutting down or they didn't believe in working from home or my visa was very strict on how long I could work somewhere. So there was just like all of these little, again, just a perfect storm of things. So that initial was a very financial roadblock because we were ready to move out. COVID rates on apartments were really good. And so we were like, okay, we're going to move out. And I ended up having to file for unemployment just because I didn't know what else to do at the time.
Yeah.
And I had a role. I was supposed to go work at Nike actually, which is so random, but
Really?
they kept saying like, yeah, you're going to start this month and you're going to start this month. And then it just kept getting pushed out, pushed out, pushed out. And it was like,
Okay.
okay. And that was kind of like the cultural thing that I realized in Australia is it's very, everybody gets their work done, but it's very laid back.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
loved that in like a corporate realm where people were much more open and flexible. But at the same time, it was just like I'm very type A. So it was a little too laid back for me. Things would drive me a little bit crazy. People didn't have any issue like pushing decisions out or not really getting back or not really replying. So that was one of the major things that I was like, I don't know what's going on. I need to know. They obviously didn't know at the time either. But that was definitely one of the frustrating things about it was like, I want to get it done right now. And I think moving and being in this culture that is very laid back, very go with the flow, even just, dating my husband, being with him for as long as I have has taught me a lot of like, it's gonna work out. And it's so cheesy because you hear that if it's like meant to be, it will. But that's
Yeah.
like what I've learned the most is like it does work out in its own way. So yeah, and then legal, there were a lot of really weird like roadblocks towards where I could start my business. I had clients from the States, so it made sense to start my business as an LLC in the States, but then trying to pay taxes in two countries. And so I have two businesses, one in Australia, one in the States as well. And they're kind of, they run together, but they have different clients and they do different things. And so it is
Okay, that's
very
so
like,
confusing.
yes, like tax wise, it makes me nervous. I'm like waiting
Yeah.
for the day somebody like knocks on my door and I'm like, I'm so sorry. But
You're
yeah,
like, "I
it is.
didn't know."
I had no
Yeah.
idea. I have a really
Yeah.
good tax guy now, but like when I first started, I was like, I have no clue what I'm supposed to do because I have a majority of my clients in the States and then I take one or two clients per year in Australia, mostly because I do in-person work. So yeah, it is just like the very like intricate balance of things.
Yeah, I would definitely will say that was, like, one of my biggest struggles as well when I was, like, constantly bouncing around countries was, like, what am I allowed to do? I don't
Yes.
understand taxes, and, like, obviously being outside of the country, like, outside of the US, like, you don't have to pay certain taxes if you are outside for X amount of days, so I'd always
Yes.
be like, "Okay, how does this work?" And then, like, for Australia, like, that was yeah, very complicated in terms of, like, setting up the business registration, and then I was like, "Okay, like, now what do I do?" And, like, everything is
Yes.
just they make it so much more complicated than it needs to be, and I feel like a lot of people don't start because they're so overwhelmed, which I definitely understand. And obviously for you, like, you've kind of learned to split, like, okay, the Australia LLC versus the US LLC, and I'm sure it's working out. It's just, yeah, it's definitely, like, a lot of moving pieces and systems and having to send it over to your tax accountant there, but kind of shifting gears just a bit. Obviously, for Claire Creative Co., like you specialize in creating feel good systems that help businesses run smoothly. So, can you kind of explain to the listeners, like, what exactly does that mean? What exactly do you do? And why is like creating those feel good systems so important for long term business success?
Yeah, so we basically focus on supporting founders and thought leaders and visionaries in their big picture goals. And a lot of the time, what I've found and the people that we work best with are the ones that have these really big visions that aren't too far off, but they don't know how to get there. So we kind
Hmm.
of think about like what their big picture goal is, and then we work backwards from that. And we create the steps for them. And the thing with being not only am I an OBM, I'm also a BA, and I have a team that works behind me, like alongside me, is that we kind of do the strategy and then we put it into place once it's approved. So most of the time, like with a coach or with somebody that is just very consultant heavy, they might only be able to give the strategy. And it was important to me because that can be very overwhelming. I've worked with a number of coaches that have the most amazing thought process and the way that their brain works. And then it just kind of stops because they don't have it's a lot to do that strategy, that like brain power to go the extra step and make those things happen, or the right support to actually put those things into place. And that's kind of what we help out with. So it is the feel good piece of it, that you know it's getting done and that you can stay in your zone of genius and make sure it's actually getting done, and also feel good in the way that you can close your laptop at the end of the day or turn your desktop off and know that it's getting done. That's with a time difference. I've thankfully managed to find a pretty good balance for when you are done with your day in the States. I'm kind of starting mine. I'm working on whatever you didn't finish. And then when you wake up, it's finished. That's like that's kind of the advantage of working with us. And the team is all over the globe, where we kind of manage those time zones and those hourly gaps really well, so that they're still supported when they're awake. And then when they're going to bed, they have me, which also helps because we get a lot of clients that have like late night thoughts and ideas, and it's like,
Yep.
yep, I'm available for those.
You're like,
So
I am
yeah.
awake.
Yeah, so that's just the way that when I was in corporate, it just never felt good. And there, I worked for some really big companies that helped a lot of people. I worked in law and I worked in finance and I worked for the Department of Behavioral Health, and it never felt good. Like the mission and the vision itself, like the intention behind what we were doing was amazing, but it just didn't feel good. And that's what I didn't make sense. Why would you run a business for people if you yourself weren't feeling good? So that's why we focus on feel good systems and also being very people first, on like, you can reach these really big goals and you can do these really big things, but if you're burnt out or you're not enjoying it or you're just like miserable, what is the point of reaching those big things?
Yeah, 100%. But I guess kind of spinning off of that, because obviously you mentioned burnout, and I think that's huge in the space. I know I
Yeah.
myself have dealt with trying to overcome burnout, especially being a social media manager, being online all the time, especially with the
Yes.
election that just happened. But for
Yes.
social media managers and service based entrepreneurs, I guess what would you say, in your own opinion, are like kind of like the core systems that they need in place to scale without that burnout?
Yeah. Yeah. So, hold on. Sorry.
You're good.
I'm like, I closed all the doors and windows so they couldn't see a single thing. Um, okay, so the main things that I would say to focus on first and foremost is like whatever you're touching day to day, like whether that's your email inbox or if it is your social media and you enjoy it, then focus on those things that you actually enjoy first. Like for me, if leads are coming in through social media and they're coming in through email, those are going to be like the first two things that I check and want to make sure that I have a system set up because they're making money. And so I also make sure that with any of those core systems, that they can be repeated. And I think that is something that gets so lost, is that every time, especially a newer entrepreneur or somebody that's kind of shifting in what they're offering, they're recreating the wheel every time. And it takes a lot of brain power and a lot of energy. And that's what ultimately leads to burnout. Like you have things in place that you're doing every single day, that's a system. Like whatever you're repeating every single day, that's a system. So I would say looking at whatever you really, really enjoy, creating a system out of that that makes it easier for you, then anything else can be delegated or automated or kind of handed off in some sort of way. AI is really big now, and I think that you shouldn't shy away from it. It has so many benefits. I think people take advantage of it and they don't use it in the right way, but it can be super helpful. So yeah, I just started using AI in my email inbox, like I said, because that's something I'm in every single day. And because of the time difference, I wake up and I might miss emails or I might have a lot to wake up to. Like waking up and my little AI bot in Gmail even is like, here's everything that came in. Here's like a summary of it. And it's like, okay, this is perfect that I can wake up and start my day that way. So taking advantage of those kinds of things in that way. But I think just really focusing on the big picture. If you want long-term success, if this isn't just a side hustle, if this isn't just a hobby for you, what does that big picture look like and what do you need to do to get there? And that's going to change as you go. But as long as you have the vision, you can kind of, change it as you go, but also find things that are easily repeatable for you to make you successful.
Yeah, definitely. I know a lot of times, like, especially when people are looking to like hire and delegate things, they're like, okay, how do I now basically get everything that's in my brain and, like, how I like to do things and then give it to
Yes, yeah,
somebody else. So I know obviously you mentioned AI, and I think that's, like, a great tool in order to be like, "Okay, here's how I do things," like, make it all organized and and
yes,
seamless, and
yes,
then, like, give it to somebody else. One thing I wanted to ask you was, I'm sure that you also help, like, your clients. Obviously, you're an OBM and a VA and kinda, like, combining those 2 roles. With that said, I know a lot of entrepreneurs kind of struggle with like client onboarding and management, and they get overwhelmed with like different client inquiries, or they're not organized. I know when I first started my business, I was like, oh my God, like, how do we set this all
yes,
up?
yeah.
And it took some time to kind of figure out the back end things. But what are some kind of like simple changes that you personally recommend to your own clients that can kind of make the whole client onboarding process a bit smoother?
Yeah, I do always recommend keeping everything in one place. And that might seem very obvious, but I've come to find out through like working with clients in this way, even when I was working for that $5 agency and I was working with so many random people, they had so many different processes and softwares that they were using that it just was not streamlined and nothing was smooth. They would have to log into a bunch of different things to find what they were looking for, or they had to like find a password and then log in. And so it's like just keep everything in one place. If you're just starting out and what that looks like is a spreadsheet, amazing, then that's what it is. But if you are ready to go to that next level, or you have the mental space to kind of look at it, something like a project management system, we use Notion inside of our
Mhm.
business. I love Notion. Yes, I know you were talking about using it. It's so pretty. It is like so nice to use. I used to use ClickUp and I use ClickUp still a lot. Just having one space where you can be like, okay, here is a lineup of all the clients we have. Here's everything that we're offering for them, especially with like social media managers. There's so many different packages that you can create. There's so many different things that you can provide. Same thing with like being an OBM and VA, like there's a difference between what we offer. And so some people come for us for OBM help or VA help or just like launch support. And so just being super clear on like, okay, this is what it looks like. This is what package they're getting. And this is like the timeline of work that we need to do. So
Mhm.
I just think that first thing is just having everything in one place. So that also helps you be aware of capacity if you're feeling like, wow, I'm like really tired or I have a lot, and like avoiding burnout is being aware of your capacity and either increasing it or shutting it down and being like, okay, this is where I can be. So that is immediately what I would say. I record a lot of what I do to make SOPs. So like Loom is huge. If you're ever like, oh, this was super helpful, I want to know how to do this again, recording a Loom video as you're doing it. I take the transcripts from Loom videos, run them through ChatGPT and have it write an SOP for me. That is like the quickest way to do that. And that's how I kind of manage with my team as well. And then whenever, like once you're at that stage to delegate, I always, because people reach out and want help and then they have no idea what they actually need help in. They're just drowning. Like when they reach out to us, they needed help like last year. And so it's
Yep.
like having to then go backwards and be like,
Yep.
okay, where did this start? What do we need to fix immediately? That whole idea of like, if we waved, I think it's in my application, like when you wave, if we could wave a magic wand over your business, like what would you immediately want help with? Like that's literally what we do in the first 30 days because it's already too late. They already needed this help. Start writing down the things that you feel resistance towards. Like for me, it was like graphic creation. Like I could write the copy and I could do the strategy, but as soon as I had to like make a pretty picture or like brand it, it was like just I
Yep.
get frustrated with it. Like
Yep.
it would just be so irritating for me. So that was the first hire I made, was like a graphic person, and I've always had a graphic person on my team that can kind of read a caption or read the strategy and be like, I know what this needs to be created. Scheduling emails, I'm really good at it. It's fine. It's just repetitive, and I could be using that like repetitive thought process on more strategy. So I bring in like a VA and an admin to help with that kind of stuff. So those things that you're feeling resistance towards, start writing them down, start timing yourself, being like, where am I spending most of my time? Those little, they're very, it sounds like a lot, but they are simple to like set a timer on how long this is taking you. Start recording this process that you have. Start keeping everything in one place to stay streamlined. Like those are such little things that you can start doing in your day to day to kind of set you up for hiring a team or increasing capacity in some way.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I know I caught myself writing like the same emails or answering the same DMs, and I'm like, okay, like I need like
Yes.
a
Yeah.
canned email response for this because sending this out every single time and like also even having this podcast, I'm like, fantastic. Now I have all these
Yes.
episodes. I'm just gonna send this to you instead of creating this like long drawn out message. Like, here, go listen to it. It has all the answers that you need in one place. So yeah,
Yes.
I think just like recognizing, and I know kind of going back to like SOPs, which for those that are listening that maybe don't know what that is, standard operating procedures. So, like Claire said, like things that you're doing over and over again,
Yes.
especially like down the line when you do want to hire a team member, you're like, okay, this is the exact process that I like to do, social media management or a strategy. So, like, this is how I walk my clients through a strategy and like kind of documenting like each step, outlining it one by one, and then being able to like actually hand it off to somebody. And I know you were talking about like using Notion and ClickUp.
Yes.
I also use ClickUp and I was like, okay, I want to make this prettier. So I also switched to
Yes.
Notion, and it's definitely been like a lifesaver just to have like everything. Again, what you said is just like all in one hub so that your
Hmm.
clients aren't like, oh my God, I have to email you this and then go to this Google Dropbox and then I have to like go to Slack and like all these different places. And then by the end, like they're not actually giving you the material because they don't even know where to like submit it
Yeah, they
into.
don't have any
Yep,
idea. Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
One thing I wanted to ask you, because obviously we talked about like ChatGPT and using it for automation, and I myself
Yeah.
love the heck out of AI. And obviously, like automation is great for efficiency, but I do think that sometimes it can feel like impersonal, especially those that like don't necessarily know how to use ChatGPT like the correct way. So how do you go ahead and balance like automation with that still like high touch personal client experience?
Yeah, so that is definitely like it's what we believe in so heavily is like a human first business
Yeah.
involves that human touch in everything that you do. So those automations, the goal is to people know that things are automated, but the goal isn't to make it like bland or lifeless. Like
Yeah.
when you get a welcome email and you know that it's automatic, it isn't just like, oh, congratulations, like here's everything you need. It's like, I'm doing it, like it's in their voice, like the
Yeah.
welcome emails that we automate. We focus on like how do they celebrate their wins or how do they like to like show up in that way? Like what's what we ask our clients like when you sign a new client, how do you actually feel about that? Like mine is like, we do a little happy dance and we literally do. Like I'm like texting Blake, like, oh my God, we got a new person for Claire Elizabeth Coates. Like so exciting, Like so that would be like something that I would include in my welcome email. Like I just texted my husband, we're so excited that you're here. And just adding those little pieces, even though it's automatic, makes such a big deal. And it doesn't have to be like automation. I think it's lost that it has to be a set it and forget it. Even with
Hmm.
like a funnel or like a passive offer or an automation, you have to go back through and always constantly be monitoring it and editing it and seeing how it goes. And so when you set something, your tone may change over time, or the process in which you do something may change over time. And it's okay to go back through and like schedule it in advance. That is still automating that to send it for that thing. So like when we sign a new client, we automate like happy birthday messages or anniversary messages or go back through and like remember all of those really important dates. So even
Yeah.
though we don't have to do it in the moment and we're not manually sending that, we're automating that for the future, which makes a huge difference in your client success and
Hmm.
adding in all of those little touch points. So I think it's just important to put yourself in the customer journey perspective. And whenever we start working with somebody and we're doing that kind of strategy, when they're like, I just want to automate this, I really asked them like, okay, if you were going through this process, how would you feel if you got this and it was just like
Yeah.
whatever? Or how would you feel if you paid all of this money and then didn't receive that message or didn't like
Yeah.
receive those things? So it's a lot of like putting yourself in. If you wouldn't buy your own product, why would you expect anybody else to? And that is what that customer journey is about, is being like, I would buy this. I like to say that I run myself through as a client in my own business when we do launches or we have new offers for Claire Elizabeth Co. And I'm like, wow, we really are good at what we do. Like, I love when I get to work with my team.
Yeah.
So I'm like, that to me is important that I feel that way because then I know we can help other people feel that way too. So it is like beyond the automation being so robotic, there are ways to make it feel more human first, as long as you are keeping that human in mind when you're creating them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the whole just like really highlighting human first, because I know I've even gotten emails or podcast pitches, and I'm like, this feels like you just mass sent this to like 10 other
Yeah.
business owners. Like, why do I want you on my podcast? I've never heard about you. Like, you don't even follow me. Like, there's just so many things that I kind of like mentally tick in my own box of like,
Yeah.
this is not personal to me, my business, or the listeners, because obviously I'm thinking about them in any way, shape, or form. So, like, approaching literally everything that you do in business,
Yes.
whether it is you yourself, because obviously, like, you're kind of acting on behalf of business owners, but like the fact that you put them in your mind of like, okay, how do we want to make sure that the emails that we're sending when somebody inquires actually sounds like them and that we're excited and like is in their same brand voice versus just getting that automated email of like, thanks for your inquiry, we'll get it, we'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Something so robotic. So yeah, I love that you do that. I wanted
Yeah.
to ask you a little bit because obviously kind of wanted to like weave in like the kind of digital nomad life. Obviously, I know you're based in Australia, so not as much nomadic, but how has living in Australia kind of changed how you approach business compared to when you were actually living in the US? Do you have any like insight on that? Maybe to somebody else who is considering living abroad, whether that's Australia. I know so many people are actually fleeing to Spain. Like, literally talk
I've
to so many
seen
business
that.
owners. Yeah, so I don't know if you have any like insight on just like how you yourself have approached a business like in the US compared to Australia.
Yeah, I definitely think if you plan on being a digital nomad or running any sort of global business where you want to work with multiple people, it isn't just like hiring an overseas VA and being like, I'm now a global business. Like, it is so
Yeah.
much more than that. And I
Yeah.
think the number one thing that I just urge anybody that is going to be, you're basically immigrating. Like, at this point, I can't even say that I'm an expat, because an expat is like, the definition of it is like moving with the intention of moving back. Like, I immigrated to Australia. I am an immigrant. Like, I
Yeah.
am that here.
Yeah.
And I think the number one thing to focus on is just like respect of the culture that you're in and around, and the people that you are working with and how they work. Like, when I first started out, like I said, it's very laid back here. If I'm
Hmm.
always pushing or pressuring, I come off very like
Yeah.
bitchy. Like, there's no other word for it. Like, I just
Yep.
come off in such a way that like nobody wants to work with me. And so having to be like, okay, instead of following up in 24 hours, I'm going to schedule this for like 72, and then that gives them time to think about it. Because when you are working with different people across the globe, their thought process is different, their buyer personality is different, the way that they make purchases is different, and you want to start learning that, especially if you want to reach out into a global market. And also just being aware of like, they have different avenues of approval for how they
Yeah.
focus on things or how they make decisions, and you have to be aware of that in order to close that deal, basically, or in order to work with them. I worked with an Australian business owner a couple of years ago. It did not, it like went up in flames.
I feel like we
And
talked
it,
about this when we went to coffee.
yes, I'm like, it was not good.
Yeah.
It was just at the time, that was like one of my first Australian clients.
Hmm.
And I was just so excited. I didn't really take into account like, they've worked this way with this timeline. Melbourne Cup is a thing. Like, it's a horse race here in Australia, but like nobody works on that day. And I'm like trying to get work done, or I like held things off and tried to get approval on that day, and it was like unresponsive. Then I'm frustrated and they're frustrated because they're like, nobody works. And it's just like, okay, well, I didn't know that at the time, or like understanding that like holidays here are like a very big thing. If they get a holiday on a Friday, they're also going to get the Monday. And it's like understanding those like little nuances of like when they're available and how they like to work. And that's with any client. I have clients that like to work at night. I have clients that like to work in the morning. It is with anybody that the hardest thing in business is like the people aspect of it. But it definitely gets harder as you move, especially with something like Spain, for example. There's going to be an initial language barrier for the dialect of Spanish that they're speaking, if they're speaking Spanish,
Yep.
or
I've
if
talked to several
they're,
people, and I
yes,
don't think
or
they're, like,
like,
fully aware of that.
no, like as like somebody with a Hispanic background, I'm Mexican, like I might be saying something and it isn't translating in that exact way. And you have to be
Mhm.
like, okay, then this is what I mean by this. Australia did not work from home at all. Like people, in fact, were like, oh, so you haven't been working. And I was like, no, I've been working. I just work from home. Like that was not a thing to kind of tell them, like, no, no, I have been working. It's just been from home. I've been working like a nine, like I work 9 to 5 was just so foreign to them. And
Yeah.
then to explain, like, these are all the softwares that we can use. Like, I've been teaching one of my Australian clients, like, how to use a CRM and how to use a project management system. Like, I think America is very good at being ahead in certain aspects. Like, my dad's worked from home since as long as I can remember, but
Mhm.
in other ways, I'm obviously very behind. But
Yep.
in that way, I think we had an advantage of being more open to these kinds of things, whereas like the culture here was like, nope, you go into office and that is
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would just like do some research, be aware of whatever language they speak. I mean, even in Australia, they say things that I'm like, I have no clue what
Oh
that
my
means.
god, yeah, I literally had to ask several people, like, I really have no idea what you just said. Yep, definitely agree, and, like, I know I have a friend, and she recently actually just moved to Portugal, or no, Spain, but she had an interior design business in Indonesia, and kinda like you, she was like, "Oh my gosh, like, just the culture, like, everything is completely different from where she was from in Denmark," and I think it was definitely, like, a learning curve and adjusting to, like, kinda like the laid back culture, like, people aren't gonna show up on time even if you give them, like, this
Yeah,
time, and just
yeah,
like certain processes and systems were very foreign to them, just like I'm sure things were foreign to her. So it's just trying to figure out, like, okay, you are in a new environment, you are in a new country, like there are going to be certain things that aren't, on your schedule or on your timeline, and you just kind of have to figure out how to make that work.
yeah. Well, I'm trying
Yeah.
to remember, is it Spain or Italy that does like a midday siesta where they like stop all work
Is that
for a couple
Italy?
of hours?
I
It
think
might
it's
be
Italy.
Italy.
I don't know. Honestly, I
I
haven't been.
remember being in Italy, like trying to go shopping or like trying to get a meal, and everything was
Yeah.
closed. And I was like, what is happening right now?
Yeah, yeah, I know. It's definitely very interesting and so different from the United States, like hustle culture. But I wanted to
Yes.
ask because
Yes.
obviously, like, you really built up your business in Australia. So, how
Yeah.
kind of did you go about like finding new clients in a foreign country, quote unquote? Like, how did you build a network? And yeah, how did you attract those like right clients after moving?
So I joined a online, one of my client at the time, this was like when everything was kind of coming to a head and everything around me was just like falling apart. I got on a call with her and she was a client, but she was like my first ever client. Like I've had her since 2018. She's been around since like longer than Blake's been around, and that's like a long time. And
Yeah,
so she kind of knew everything, and we would do like a little 30-minute like personal catch up and then jump into work. And like in that personal catch up, I was just like in tears. Like I just could not do it anymore. I didn't know what to do. Everything just didn't feel like it was worth it. I was really feeling, I never regretted the decision to move, but I really was like, what is my purpose in moving? Like. And so she had heard from one of her other friends at the time that they went through this thing called the Start with Sarah Wiles. And the program has shifted so much now. It's like much more advanced and they cover a lot more. But it was like a VA training program basically. And even though I was already a VA, I wasn't plugged into anything. I was like posting on LinkedIn, I'm posting on Facebook. There's no strategy. I have no idea who I want to work with. I have no idea like any of that. So she actually paid for me to do the Start program with Sarah Wiles. And it was like it used to be 4 weeks, I think, 4 to 6 weeks. It was like a sprint basically. Like I
okay.
was on these calls at 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm like showing up to do this like mastermind group. It was kind of like a mastermind, but it was like for very new people. And when you were done with that, she opened up this lead network. So people can, even to this day, like you can fill out a form and be matched to a VA.
Yeah.
I'm one of those VAs in the system. And so that was like super, super beneficial to be plugged in that way, that I had clients that you had to like say why you would fit with them. And you basically had to learn the sales process from there. So it was super beneficial. It's still the same way. And that's why I love being plugged into that community. But it was just huge to have some sort of network. And if you're just moving to a new place, I cannot recommend more, like getting plugged into some sort of community or network, whether in person or online, finding people that are very similar to you. I use threads, like, even though some of it can be a little like, what do they call it? Like baity, like when they post and they're like, is anybody around here? And they get all these comments and then like never reply. Like, if you're intentional about it, that's how I've connected with so many people is through threads. I'm being like, I'm in Sydney. Is anybody interested in this? Would anybody want to do this? And like actually going through those replies and messaging those people. So I would really recommend, even before moving, if you are thinking about it, there's Facebook groups out there. Like, I joined a Facebook group very specifically for the type of visa that I had and the process that I had so that I could learn from other people. There's, like I said, threads, but the groups, finding just something even before moving, if you're even thinking about it, just to be like, have that expectations before. Because I was like, I'm going to move and find a job and everything is going to be sunshine and rainbows. And it was just not
Yep.
that for like the
Yep.
first year.
Yep.
So it just helps like managing very realistic expectations when you get plugged in very early on. And yeah, that's kind of, I was plugged into a network and then was able through that program, learned a lot about who I wanted to work with and my marketing and my voice and all of that, my ideal audience, and then was really able to take advantage of that. And now it's kind of like, now I know I want to speak more and I want to build a network in this way and I want to have these conversations. And so it'll change as you go. But I think initially, and especially when you're like trying to land clients quickly, just immediately, if you're thinking about it, find a group, learn about it,
Yep.
do your due diligence.
Yeah, no, I love that. I know I had a social media management client and she actually told me about like a networking group in Australia. It's called Launchpad if you ever look it up. I don't know if they
Yes, I
I
think
feel like
I
they
was,
do events in Sydney.
yeah, yeah. I'm like, I feel like
Yeah.
I'm in a Facebook group that sounds familiar to that.
Yeah, it's basically like one of my social media management clients told me about it when I was first moving to Australia, and she was like, "Oh my god, you should join. They have like a bunch of meetups in the Gold Coast." And I was like, "Fantastic," because like I don't know anyone, and also like
Yeah,
obviously kind of going from Bali, which is like digital nomad heaven, and everyone has an online business that's like a
yes,
foreigner essentially, to then going to Australia where it's kind of like the US is very much like corporate culture in a way. And so I just kind
yeah,
of had like culture shock in that regard of like, oh my God, like I
yeah,
don't know anyone that has an online business. I feel very isolated. So like having that network of people, and I think we met up like every couple of weeks. Yeah, like 2 times a month, and just like having them to be like, okay, like bouncing ideas, or when I had like a nightmare roommate situation, I had like
yeah,
a literally meltdown in front of them, and I was like, I need to find new housing. So just like having that group of people, like you said, is just like a great way to have that network. And like I even got clients out of it. So yeah, I think those are all fantastic tips. Kind of going back to, I know that obviously you said you have clients in the US, and I know kind of balancing like different time zones can be
yes, yeah.
challenging. So how do you go ahead and like stay organized and kind of like maintain your work life balance with the whole time zone changes and just like, I guess, cultural challenges as well?
Yeah, so I used to work nights and then very quickly realized that was not for me because my husband works during the day. So it just was not. I know there's people out there that do that, and that for them is amazing. It just is not, it was not sustainable for me. So I work very weird hours that are, they're not even weird to me anymore. I'm like, I just work my normal hours. I work like 6 a.m. to about 11. And then I usually like to go to the gym or take the dogs for a walk or kind of break in the afternoon when clients are officially, by that point, clients are usually asleep. So I don't have to worry about anything coming in that needs immediate attention. And then I come back on around like 7 p.m. after dinner. And then I'm on from like 7 p.m. to about 11 p.m. The one thing that really changed was not taking calls at certain times because I used to feel bad. I'm the only one in a different time zone. Majority of my clients were American. I was like, I have to, do what I can for them. So I would take calls at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and it
Oh
like
my
nobody
God.
wins. Nobody wins. I was exhausted.
Yep.
I wasn't thinking straight. Like my strategy wasn't what it should have been. And it's like you live and learn those things. But that was the one thing to have those boundaries around. I only take calls after 6 a.m. And even sometimes I will have to be like, look, I didn't get a good night's sleep. I cannot just like wake up and start this call and have to push it. but it's also being very open and honest and communicative about those things too. Like at the end of the day, we're human. We're also like, we're business owners, but we're also human. And that human first piece, again, is just being honest on like, I want my client to get the most out of this. So if I have to push a meeting, then that's what unfortunately I have to do. So I don't take calls before 6 a.m. anymore. And I don't take calls after 11 p.m. And then I stagger. So if I have like a 10 p.m. call, I will not have a 6 a.m. call the next day. And I'll have like a later start. So it's just about being open about that though. Some clients like expect me, they don't expect it, but they kind of anticipate me being up at a certain time that like before I go to bed, I'm like, is there anything right now that I can take care of? Because I'm going to be like on a little bit later because I'm up a little bit later tonight. And so it's really important to find those people that understand that you're not a robot. You can't be available 24/7. And
No.
then also important to learn how to communicate those time differences too. I think it's like whenever I see job posts that are like, oh, we're only open to US applicants, or we're only open, like I only opened up my support role to EST time zone just because it needed to overlap with clients. But anybody can cover a time zone if that's what their working hours are, realistically, if that's what they're doing. So I think it's just setting those boundaries and being super solid in, this is what I do, this is when I'm willing to work, and this is not. And you'll find your rhythm as you're working through it.
Yeah, definitely. I know when I was living in Bali, like kind of similar to Australia, I was like, this actually works out really well because it was like my morning and then their evening, and sort of similar with Australia, kind of their afternoon. But I was
Yeah.
like, I like to work in the morning. So, like, actually being able to be like, okay, cool. Like, this works for me. These are my set times. Like, I do not have time at 3 in the morning. Like, I
Yeah.
will not be available. And, like, I do like that Dubsado, like, has it. So, like, I can set everything in my time zone. But then when they go on
Yes.
their, like, calendar or my scheduling link, they can see it in their time zone. So it's like, okay, like what works best. I have had people say like, hey, I can't find any times on here. And I'm like, okay, like what times would work for you? And then
Yeah.
yeah, being upfront and being like, I am in Australia or I am in this country. So like,
Yeah.
just a heads up, I will not be operating at 1
Yeah.
or 2 in the morning. So yeah,
Yeah.
I've definitely had that. And like there were a few occasions where like I really wanted to hop on this podcast and I like woke up at 4 in the morning and I was like, this is very much like a one-off situation. Like I would not do
Yes.
this
Yeah.
for like a client. Like I wouldn't have a discovery call at 4 in the morning because then you're gonna have a client that's like, oh look, she's available. And like no fault to
Yeah.
them. Like they just wouldn't know. And they're like, okay, cool. This is like a regular time that I can expect Claire or Shannon to be on. And you're like, no, no. That was like a
Yeah.
one-time thing. So yeah,
Yes.
I love all those tips. But with that said, Claire, thank you so, so much for coming on the podcast. Where can the listeners go and find you and connect with you further?
Yeah, amazing. I'm so glad we got to talk about all the things. I think this was super helpful, and I'm so glad to talk to somebody that gets it. You've lived here and you've moved back. You are just like so familiar with the whole thing. So, yeah, I can be found on Instagram. That's where I
Mhm.
primarily am because I love it so, so much at claire.e.french. And then my website is just claireelizabeth.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for coming on the podcast. It was also so lovely to see you again.
Yes, it was so nice
But
talking to you.
I'll go ahead and leave all of Claire's information, Instagram links, anything else that you want to include within the podcast description below. But with that said, thank you so much for coming on the Tropical Social Podcast.
Thank you for having me.